Hey, how's it going tonight, guys? Hope you're ready to get some fishing tips tonight. We got a lot of different topics to talk about. You guys were great in writing in and giving me some questions on different things to talk about. Unfortunately, tonight the wife won't be joining us. She had a couple things come up, and so I'm going to be shooting this video here solo tonight. And so to get things started, this past weekend made it down the Lake of the Ozarks. So I'm going to give you guys a fishing report. We put in up in the Gravois arm. What we did was we ran around, checked a lot of brush piles, and usual spots that seem to work this time of the year really well for me. And kind of what we determined fishing a lot of those spots was the fish really aren't so much in the brush piles. They're kind of around them, but not really down in them. Wasn't able to get anything going with the jig this past Sunday. But what we did do is we did manage to catch a few fish on jerk baits and Alabama rigs. It seemed like the fish were on about 10 foot or so, suspending at that 10 foot. Seemed like most of the fish were suspending. Saw a few fish down on the bottom, but most of the fish we caught were suspended, and most of the bites that we got came probably within 6 or 7 feet from the bank. We ended up catching a lot of fish throwing jerkbaits and Alabama rigs on rocky banks. It seemed like the banks where the sun was really beating down on them were the best. That's where we were able to get bit. We didn't catch a whole lot of fish. We probably caught like 17 fish or so on the day. Probably had 7 or so keepers. Wasn't too good of a day of fishing. Probably had like 13 to 14 pounds, but regardless, we were able to catch a few fish. We tried a lot of new different things. I know I was testing a lot of different baits that I'm kind of curious about, maybe being potential players this upcoming tournament season. So just one of those days, you get out, you try a lot of new things, and just kind of have fun with it and see what you can come up with. So for jerk baits, it seemed like a jerk bait like this one here, a white one, seemed to work the best, and I think that's because the water is getting a little stained in a lot of places. Some of the areas, like up in the Gravois, it was getting to be stained up pretty good. You can still see your bait down about a foot or so, but if you're throwing one like this, but a little bit dirtier than what you'd usually find up there, I think, this time of the year. And for Alabama rigs, we're using rigs like this 3-arm wire one here from Cellar Baits. And it seems like the white baits, any kind of white swim bait that we put on there, we were able to catch some fish on that. And so I think right now a lot of the fish are kind of scattered out. I'd be running a lot of different spots until I found a couple places that were holding some fish, and it seemed like the fish were pretty much on the bank that we were catching. I'm sure there's fish to be caught out deeper, but it seemed like the ones that we were catching were really close to that bank. So this week is also important because I'm going to be heading to Florida tomorrow, kicking off the Costa Series event down there on Lake Okeechobee. So my wife, she's going to be driving me to the airport tomorrow. I'm going to be flying down. So far the word on the street is that Okeechobee's fishing a little bit different than it usually does this time of the year. I've been reading some of the different reports that are out online. Seems like the lake's really low. The water's a little bit dirty. That might play into my strengths. I don't know. Might be able to get on some kind of a crankbait bite or a chatterbait bite, something with a moving bait, which is what I like to do anyways. But I don't know if I'm going to get to bring out, if I'm going to get to do a lot of flipping like I was hoping for. So we're just going to have to see how that plays out. And I'm going to be practicing on Wednesday and looking forward to getting at least 2 days of fishing in. After 2 days, they're going to cut to the top 10 for Saturday's final top 10. And but I'm going to be down there until Sunday. I'll be flying back Sunday. And hopefully get to catch a little bit of the football game too. So, so super pumped. Pretty much, every weekend, kicking off this weekend, I'll be fishing. When I get back from Florida, I'm going to be fishing in Arkansas. I'm going to Lake Hamilton. Looking forward to that. That could be a good tournament. Might be some jerkbait bite going on down there. And then I'm going to be going on to Lake Washita down in Arkansas. That lake's been really good to me. When I was in college, we got second in an FLW college tournament down there on jerk baits. Never been to the lake before. I think we caught around like 13 or so pounds with 5 fish when it was kind of tough. And I've had a couple checks in the BFLs down there, so looking forward to getting back to Ouachita. And then once March gets here, got a tournament nearly every single weekend, so we're getting down to fishing here finally, which is what I like to do the most anyways. This off season just kind of drives me crazy sitting around the house, and so ready to get going, ready to get pumped up and get out there and do some fishing. So like one of the questions one of the guys had was he wanted to know the difference in when do you use heavy wire versus light wire hooks. Okay, so for me, what I like to do is I like to get away with the lightest wire that I possibly can. And I think a light wire hook has several advantages over a thicker wire hook. If you're using a light wire hook, it seems like you get an easier hook set than you do if you use a real thick one. Most of the time, you can use a hook that's fairly light unless you're fishing like really heavy cover. A light wire hook really helps you out if you're making really long casts and you get bit on the end of a really long cast. You're just going to get a better hook set and you're probably going to catch more fish than a heavy gauge one. The thing about a light wire hook too is with a lot of different baits, if you put a light wire hook in there, sometimes it gives the bait better action. But then there's also times too, like say if I'm throwing like a fluke and I want it to get down more, or some kind of a Senko that I want it to sink really good, I might put a heavier hook in there just because that heavier hook's going to give it a little bit more weight. But yeah, most of the time I'm just going to use, like a standard worm hook, because I think the question is about worm fish. I'm just going to use a standard, just a regular straight shank worm hook for most of my fishing. If I'm going to be flipping into heavy cover, I'm going to upsize my hook and go with a little bit heavier one just because I might have to pull that fish out of some cover. Most of the time though with hooks nowadays, you don't really have to worry too much about flexing out your hook unless you're really cranking on them. So I think there's times, like I said, when that light wire hook, say sometimes, you pitch up to a bank and, that fish starts swimming towards you. If you got a little bit lighter wire hook, I think it's easier to get that hook in them. So most of the time I try to use the lightest hook that I can get away with. But there are times, like say, if I'm flipping, some kind of vegetation or something like that, I might use a heavier hook. But like I said, most of the time it's a light wire hook for me. Another one of the questions I had was, when do I use different types of line? So for me, for any type of topwater fishing, most of the time I'm going to throw braid. Braid works really nice with your different walking baits, your buzz baits. I really like braid on that. If the fish are really eating that topwater good, I might use like some kind of mono if I'm making more like shorter casts. But if I'm throwing like way out, like on a flat or something like that, most of the time I use braid just because it's going to let me work that topwater bait a little bit better. Fluorocarbon line, where I like fluorocarbon line is when I'm fishing clear water or if I'm fishing deep, because it has a little bit less stretch than like a monofilament line. Any type of like bottom baits like jigs, plastic worms, as long as I'm not flipping, most of the time what I'm going to do is I'm going to use fluorocarbon. For me, what works better is for flipping, I like to throw 20-pound mono a lot of times for my flipping, just because I'm so close to the fish that I like a little bit of stretch in there. And most of the time I'll throw monofilament when I'm cranking. I like to throw that a lot when I'm throwing crankbaits, any kind of moving bait. I'm kind of still a big fan of a monofilament line. So for most of my fishing, I'll do 10 to 12 pound tests on my crankbaits with mono. For my jigs and my plastic worms, usually I'll throw anywhere from 15 to 20 pound fluorocarbon line. A lot of times I'm throwing 15 and 17 pound line. If I can get away with it, obviously if I'm going to be fishing like some heavy cover, like some brush piles or something like that around docks, I'm going to upsize my line just because, they will get you around that brush. And, yeah, I'm pretty simple when it comes to my line. Another question I had was, when would you use a spinning rod versus a bait caster? What kind of techniques would you use that for this time of the year? So me, I'm actually really big on spinning rods nowadays. It used to be like, when I first started fishing, and I was fishing in college and stuff like that. Didn't really own a whole lot of spinning gear. Pretty much limited myself to bait casting. But if you fish, a lot of different lakes and you fish all year long, there's a lot of situations that come up where you really want to have some spinning rods. So I like to throw spinning. Anytime I'm throwing, line that's like smaller than 10-pound tests. So I like spinning on, like small crankbaits. If I got to throw a light crankbait, I really like a spinning rod with that. Shaky heads, love spinning, Ned rigs, tubes, drop shot. I also throw jerkbait sometimes on a spinning rod. That can make it really easy if you need to make a really long cast and it's really windy out. Spinning rod works really good for that. For bait casting, I really like bait casting for like a lot of my crankbaits. And any type of technique where I'm gonna have to use like heavier line and I need a little bit more power to move that fish. So like flipping, really like to use bait caster when I'm flipping, throw in some kind of top water like a frog or a buzz bait. Big crankbaits, it just seems like you have more power, and you really do with a bait casting reel and rod when you're throwing a really big crankbait. That's something that I really like to do a lot of. So I almost always use a bait caster for that. And like spinner baits, throw that on a bait caster. Seems to work really good for me. And like I said, on my bait casters, I have anything from 12 to 25-pound tests. My spinning rods usually 10 and under. Really, most of the time, I don't go too much lighter than 8-pound line for around here. But there are some times where I think, like, if you're throwing some really small finesse type baits, if you get down to 6, it can help you get a few more bites. But most of the time, don't really even mess with that. So yeah, those were some of the questions I had that came in. I think like one of the things like this year that I'm gonna try to do, and I've gotten better at, as I've matured, is learning to take the hits as they come in tournament fishing. I think some advice for a lot of people that are starting out with fishing tournaments is you're gonna have your bad tournaments. You're gonna have tournaments where things just don't work out, and what you're gonna have to do is come back and get them next time. And if you have that type of attitude, you're gonna see that if you can keep that attitude and believe that you're actually a good fisherman, you're gonna have your time when you're gonna catch the fish, and you can't get down on yourself. And so that's some advice I'd have for people that are fishing this year. If you had a bad year last year, think of it as you could have a good year this year coming up. So that's one of the things that I like to keep in mind. Because with fishing, a lot of things have to line up in order to do well. So what I like to do is just try to be consistent. Go out there with the attitude. I'm going to try to catch as many fish as I can, but I'm not going to get too high or too low. As the season progresses, I'm just going to try to keep that that steady mindset, and just kind of take each day as it happens. Because I think, like I said, a lot of times I think people that have a really good tournament, and they're like way up here, and then you have a couple bad ones, you get way down here, and a lot of people get kind of bummed out, and they let that affect the next tournament. So the best thing you can do is keep that focus, because I know, like myself, when I first started really getting into the tournaments, if I had a bad tournament, man, it'd really get me down, and you'd be like, oh, I don't even know if I can catch fish, and I don't know what I'm doing. But sometimes there's a lot of different variables going on, so keep that in mind this year. And yeah, so this video is going to be a little bit shorter. We're going to keep the show a little bit shorter because I'm actually getting on a plane tomorrow, flying down to Okeechobee. looking to get to test the waters of Florida down there. Fished a little bit in Florida. I've been on the St. Johns River before, and it was a blast. I went down there about a year ago, and really had a good time throwing frogs and fishing all the different vegetation down there. It was a blast. Saw a lot of alligators, which is always kind of cool, and yeah, so looking forward to that. I'm really looking forward to getting out of St. Louis here. Supposed to get this really cold weather, and I mean it's hit tonight even. It's like super cold out there, so I'm glad I'm going to be getting away from that for a week, and yeah, we'll see what I can do down there. Heard the water is a little dirty, so hopefully get around some fish. But yeah, I got everything packed. I don't know. I try to get as much into my what do you call it, suitcase, I guess you could say, travel bag, whatever. Try to get as many baits in there as I could. I got a lot of stuff waiting for me down there at the lake. The one thing I did bring with me was a whole lot of crankbaits because the water's supposed to be really muddy, and yeah, just looking forward to to this adventure. So yeah, so guys, stay tuned. We're gonna have a video every Wednesday coming out. Next week's gonna be really good because I'm gonna get a lot of different pictures from my fishing experience down there in Florida. So you guys won't want to miss that. Like and subscribe to the channel. We're gonna be covering, and next week I'll have a tournament recap on how we do down there. We're gonna do that for every tournament this year that I fish, and so I'm gonna be sharing my experiences, sharing what worked, what didn't work. Probably more of what didn't work, since that happens a lot in fishing. So stay with us this year. We're going to be covering a lot of different stuff, and we'll see you guys next Wednesday. And tune in, follow me for this tournament. We'll see what happens. Until next time, guys, take it easy.